Dear friends, welcome to another thrilling episode of The Military Informant. In today's video, we will discuss the popular uprising in Venezuela against Nicolas Maduro's electoral fraud. But what can truly happen in that country? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Immediately after the announcement of the initial partial election results in Venezuela on Sunday, July 28th, it became evident that dictator Nicolas Maduro was willing to manipulate the electoral outcomes. Numerous protests erupted across the country. Thousands of people expressed their indignation in various ways, including destroying Nicolas Maduro's electoral signs and propaganda, as well as statues of Hugo Chavez, the founder of the Chavista regime that has controlled Venezuela since 1999. These protests intensified after the CNE, the body responsible for organizing elections and counting votes, refused to continue releasing the election records. Without proving the numbers, they simply declared Nicolas Maduro the winner. Over time, as records were slowly released, it became increasingly clear that Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate supported by Maria Corina Machado, had actually won the election by a wide margin. By the end of Monday, July 29th, with 73.25% of the records released, the Venezuelan opposition reported that Edmundo Gonzalez had garnered more than 6.2 million votes, while Maduro had less than 2.8 million, confirming the electoral fraud. These revelations and the confirmation of electoral fraud intensified the protests in Venezuela, leading to the first violent clashes between protesters and Maduro-controlled police forces. On Tuesday, July 30th, Maria Corina Machado released all 73.25% of the already available records, allowing all voters to verify their votes. With Nicolas Maduro's electoral fraud effectively confirmed and protests intensifying, what can happen next in Venezuela? The country is at a tipping point with much depending on numerous variables. To simplify the analysis, let's focus on the most likely scenarios, starting with the main one. Nicolas Maduro clinging to power with all his might. As mentioned, the records proved that Maduro did not win the election. Nevertheless, the CNE, entirely controlled by Maduro, officially declared him the winner, indicating that Maduro is determined to hold on to power at any cost, even in the face of irrefutable evidence of fraud, such as the voting records. In this scenario, extreme violence in Venezuelan streets is likely, with Maduro's police, military, and paramilitary forces acting with maximum brutality to suppress the protests. This would be a potentially more violent version of the protests that erupted in the country between 2019 and 2020, which left over 100 dead, thousands injured, and more than 1,000 imprisoned, with many simply disappearing in Maduro's dungeons. Those protests highlighted the unconditional support of the Venezuelan armed forces for Maduro's regime, something that hasn't changed, even after some police units joined the protesters. After those protests, Maduro further strengthened his security forces, making them even more loyal to his dictatorship. Therefore, despite some police officers not directly intervening in the protests, these appear to be more strategic retreats in the face of large crowds, rather than instances of police and military joining the protesters. For now, it seems that Venezuela's security forces remain 100% loyal to Maduro's dictatorship, merely managing the crisis to prevent the protests from escalating out of control. Thus, in this scenario, with Maduro ignoring the fraud evidence and holding on to power, the protests will intensify, and the security forces, as I mentioned, remain loyal to Maduro, will respond increasingly violently to prevent the regime's downfall. However, a slight variation of this scenario involves the insubordination of some military units led by lower-ranking officers. As I have mentioned in other videos on this channel, Maduro has bought the loyalty of his military through mass promotions, making Venezuela one of the countries with the highest number of colonels and generals in the world, meaning that large combat units, like battalions, are unlikely to rise against the regime as a whole. But small units led by lower-ranking officers, such as captains, may join the protesters. History is filled with examples of military uprisings led by captains, such as the April 25, 1974 revolution in Portugal, the famous Carnation Revolution, which began with the armed forces movement, mostly composed of captains. In this scenario, there is a real risk of civil war in Venezuela, with Maduro supported by part of his army advancing against the protesters, who would be backed by other sectors of the Venezuelan armed forces. A civil war of this nature in Venezuela could result in a terrible toll of casualties, especially among civilians, making it the worst possible scenario. Finally, there is the scenario in which Maduro, isolated internationally after the opposition presents compelling evidence of fraud, simply flees the country with his family and top regime members, seeking refuge in a country without extradition agreements, such as Iran, China, or Russia. In this scenario, clearly the best, the Chavista dictatorship would end without street confrontations. In the short and medium term, the heavy sanctions imposed on Maduro's regime would be lifted, and Venezuela would gradually return to economic, political, and social normality. As you can see, there are many different scenarios that could unfold, with much depending on what happens in the coming hours and days. To stay updated, follow the news on Twitter and our YouTube channel. The links are in the description. Stay tuned for more updates and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to support us, and stay informed about the latest analyses and information on key geopolitical issues worldwide.
Con el 80% de las mesas escrutadas y con un nivel de participación electoral del 59%, los resultados son los siguientes. Primero, Nicolás Maduro Moro, del Gran Polo Patriótico, obtuvo 5.150.092 votos, con un 51.20%. El candidato Edmundo González, de la Mesa de la Unidad, obtuvo 4.000.000. Otros candidatos tuvieron 462.704